Some names and details in this story have been changed for anonymity and confidentiality. Not all photographs are from the actual scene.
In mid-December of 2017, a group of cavers were descending on safety ropes into a deep vertical well in Desolation Canyon, Utah. These narrow crevices along the Green River had always remained completely flooded, but due to an abnormal drought, the water level had dropped critically. At a depth of several hundred feet, in the pitch black of an isolated underground lake, the researchers suddenly heard a soft splash. The beam of a headlamp caught a gruesome scene on the wet rocks. An extremely emaciated creature with pale gray skin was curled up in a ball. She made a dull hissing sound, covered her face with her hands from the saving light, and continued to mechanically chew on a live, blind cavefish. This woman was 29-year-old Priscilla Grant. 18 months ago, on June 12, 2016, she and her two friends disappeared without a trace during a tourist rafting trip. The police, rescuers, and relatives had long since presumed them dead, believing that the bodies had been carried away by a raging river. No one could have imagined that Priscilla had been alive all along, trapped in a blind stone trap underground. But the most frightening part of the story was not how she managed to survive in complete darkness, but why she was there and where Bonnie and Marlene had gone. On June 12, 2016, the sun was blazing with merciless intensity over the town of Green River, Utah. The temperature reached 95 degrees Fahrenheit in the shade. Around 11 o'clock in the morning, a dark gray SUV pulled into the parking lot of a local gas station. Three young women got out of the car. They were 29-year-old Priscilla Grant, 28-year-old Bonnie Jones, and their peer, 29-year-old Marlene Watson. All three lived in Salt Lake City. This summer, the friends planned a large-scale 6-day rafting trip down the bottom of Desolation Canyon, one of the most remote corners of the American West. CCTV footage from a gas station showed that the women had been inside for 22 minutes. The station's cashier would later testify that the tourists were in high spirits and seemed focused. They bought iced tea, ready-made sandwiches, and 2 packs of lithium batteries for flashlights. The worker remembered this group because one of the girls asked him about the weather forecast for the next 6 days. He replied that it was going to be a critical heat wave and not a single drop of rain. At 12 o'clock 15 minutes, the SUV pulled up at the dock of a tourist center on the outskirts of the city. The instructor of the base later told the detectives that he noticed their professional approach. The tourists had the highest class equipment, a multi-seat raft made of green polyurethane, durable waterproof bags for provisions, and life jackets. At 1 hour and 30 minutes in the afternoon, the women officially registered the route in the Park Service's logbook. The expedition was to last exactly 6 days, with a total length of 84 miles. They were to walk about 14 miles each day. The end point was Swayze Beach, where commercial transportation was to be waiting for them. The return time was June 18th, 16 hours and 0 minutes. Leaving their car in the parking lot, the women launched the raft and disappeared around the first bend in the river. Desolation Canyon fully lives up to its name, which translates to Canyon of Desolation. It is a labyrinth of sheer red cliffs that rise more than 5,000 feet above the water. There is absolutely no communication coverage and no way to evacuate on foot. The river is squeezed into a narrow gorge, where calm sections suddenly give way to aggressive rapids of the 4th and 5th difficulty categories. On June 18th, at exactly 16 o'clock, the transport arrived at the Swayze Beach. The minibus driver waited for more than 2 hours, but not a single boat appeared on the river. The next morning, June 19th, the relatives raised the alarm. At 10 o'clock in the morning, The Emery County Sheriff's Office officially reported Priscilla Grant, Bonnie Jones, and Marlene Watson missing. A large-scale search operation was immediately launched. Patrol helicopters of the Department of Public Safety took to the skies. Their task was to methodically comb every bend in the river from the air. At the same time, boats and ranger teams headed upstream from the beach. During the operation, the rangers interviewed other groups. Witnesses confirmed that they had seen a green raft with 3 women on June 14th at about the 30th mile marker from the start. They were behaving absolutely appropriately and professionally, navigating areas with calm currents. This is the last point of their stay. On the 4th day of the search, June 22nd, the first clue appeared. The rescue team was exploring a section of the river downstream of the Coal Creek Rapids, one of the most dangerous places in the entire canyon. In the plant, the rescuers noticed a piece of green material. It was a torn polyurethane measuring 3 by 4 feet. Forensic analysis confirmed that this material was identical to the texture of the women's raft. The edges of the tear indicated a catastrophic impact on an underwater rock. 5 hours later, the helicopter spotted another object near the shore. It turned out to be the life jacket of the tourists. Its straps were securely fastened, but the vest itself was empty. No other traces were found. By August 2016, the active phase of the work was officially wrapped up. The district authorities published a final report. This document dryly stated that the raft had overturned as a result of a powerful impact on rocks. According to the investigation, the women were pulled into underwater whirlpools, and their bodies were forever trapped under boulders at the bottom. The police closed the case, being absolutely sure that they were right. But they were fatally mistaken in their conclusions. The merciless river did not take everything. Deep in the cold bowels of the rocks, where the sun's rays never penetrated, one of them was still breathing, hearing only the endless, eerie noise of black water around her. Exactly 18 months have passed. Desolation Canyon had kept its secrets well until nature intervened. The fall of 2017 was abnormally dry for Utah. The water level in the Green River began to fall rapidly, exposing banks that had remained hidden for centuries under the thickness of muddy streams. By mid-December 2017, the water had receded an unprecedented 50 feet below its historical low. This natural phenomenon opened up access to underwater cave systems in the lower part of the canyon that had previously been considered completely inaccessible to humans. On December 15th, at 8 o'clock in the morning, a group of 4 extreme cavers arrived at the Coal Creek Rapids area. According to their itinerary, the purpose of the expedition was to map the newly formed dry crevasses. The researchers had professional equipment with them: hundreds of feet of Kevlar ropes, sturdy carabiners, portable oxygen tanks in case of toxic gas accumulation, and powerful headlamps. At 10 o'clock and 30 minutes in the morning, the men found a narrow crevice in the solid rock. This entrance had been completely flooded by a raging stream a few months ago. The hole was so tight that they had to take off some of their outer gear to squeeze inside the stone mouth. The descent lasted almost 2 hours. The cavers carefully moved along a vertical stone well that was over 200 feet deep. The air temperature dropped rapidly, stopping at 42 degrees Fahrenheit. The walls of the well were covered with a slippery coating of river silt and sharp mineral deposits. At 12 o'clock and 50 minutes, the first of the explorers touched the hard surface with his feet. When the whole group successfully descended to the bottom, they found themselves in a huge underground cave. Absolute pitch blackness reigned here. It was a primitive, thick gloom that instantly absorbed any weak light source and created the illusion of complete loss of orientation in space. The air was heavy, stale, and full of the smells of damp earth, old decay, and stagnant water. Turning on the flashlights at maximum power, the cavers saw a wide underground lake in front of them. It was formed as a result of the constant filtration of river water through microscopic cracks in the massive rock. The water was icy, pitch black, and motionless, like a mirror in a crypt. The group began to move slowly along the rugged bank of the underground reservoir. Each cautious step echoed off the high stone vaults with a repeated, dull echo. Drops of cold condensation monotonously fell from the ceiling. There was not a single sign of life around, not a single sound except for their own intense breathing and the noise of the drops. Suddenly, at 13 hours and 15 minutes, the group leader sharply raised his clenched fist, giving a mute command to stop immediately. According to the speleologists, in the complete silence, they heard a sound that did not fit into the natural rhythm of the dead cave. It was a quiet but distinct splash of water at the opposite edge of the lake, about 60 feet away. The man turned his head slowly, directing a narrow beam of light toward the source of the sound. The beam snatched from the gloom a scene that instantly took the breath away from experienced adventurers and made their blood run cold. A human being was sitting on wet, slime-covered stones, curled up in an unnatural ball. It looked like a nightmare materialized in physical reality. The body was critically emaciated, resembling a skin-covered skeleton. The skin had turned a frightening pale gray, almost translucent shade, devoid of any pigment due to the long absence of sunlight. His long, extremely dirty hair, tangled in tight, stiff clumps, fell over his thin shoulders, partially hiding his face and protruding collarbones. When the bright light of the flashlight hit the creature directly in the eyes, the woman reacted instantly. Instead of screaming or asking for help, she let out a dull, animalistic hissing sound that echoed throughout the cave. Shrinking in panicked terror, she abruptly scrambled into the deepest corner between the massive boulders and covered her face with her dirty, cut hands. She was desperately trying to hide from the life-saving radiance that her eyes had not seen in a year and a half. The light caused her unbearable physical pain. The cavers were frozen in place, unable to take a step. In the woman's thin, trembling fingers with broken nails, a blind cavefish was clutched tightly, still flailing, trying to escape from the deadly grip. Dirty water ran down her wrists. Not paying any more attention to the presence of strangers, the woman instinctively brought the prey to her chapped lips and began to chew the raw, living meat methodically, with primitive cruelty. In this eerie dungeon, isolated from the entire human world, she turned into a predator whose only goal was to survive at all costs. This was Priscilla Grant, who was officially declared dead 18 months ago. But the bottomless, dark tunnel behind her hid a much more terrifying secret, a gruesome answer to where the other two women had disappeared to, and what Priscilla actually ate before the water level allowed her to fish. Dear viewers, before we continue to dive into this chilling story, I have a small request for you. Please subscribe to the channel, leave a comment, and be sure to like the video. YouTube's algorithms work in such a way that it is your activity that helps promote my video. Thanks to your reactions, the platform will show this video to new viewers, and even more people will learn about this amazing story of survival. Your support is extremely important. Now let's get back to Utah. The evacuation of Priscilla Grant from the underground trap proved to be a complex logistical operation that took nearly 8 grueling hours. The rescuers had to deploy a system of blocks and Kevlar cables to lift her extremely carefully up a vertical well to the surface. The woman was so weak that she had to be rigidly fixed in a special plastic stretcher. Any careless movement could have caused her exhausted heart to stop. Around 9 o'clock in the evening, the rescue helicopter landed on the roof of the University of Utah Hospital in Salt Lake City. The patient was immediately taken to the intensive care unit under heavy police guard. Intensive care doctors were openly shocked by the state of her body. The medical report stated that the girl had lost almost 40% of her total body weight. From 130 pounds, her weight dropped to a critical level of 78 pounds. Due to the complete absence of sunlight for 18 months, she developed a severe vitamin D deficiency. In addition, doctors diagnosed an early stage of scurvy due to a prolonged lack of micronutrients. Her skin was covered with ulcers, her gums were bleeding, and her muscles had almost completely atrophied due to lack of movement. Priscilla's eyes were so unaccustomed to daylight that doctors had to completely isolate her room. They closed the windows with dark curtains and turned on the lamps at minimum power, creating twilight. Any ray of light caused her acute physical pain and eye spasms. In addition, the girl could not eat regular food at all. Her digestive system simply did not accept anything except intravenous drips with nutrient solutions. But the deepest trauma was hidden in her psyche. Priscilla's mind was so crippled by isolation that she completely lost the ability to socialize. The girl did not speak, did not respond to her name, and refused to contact the staff. When the nurses entered the room, she would shudder in terror. Priscilla categorically refused to sleep on a soft mattress. She moved around the room only on all fours, hiding under the metal frame of the bed like an animal in a hole, and sitting there for hours in a fetal position. She reacted to any sharp sounds, clanking of instruments or footsteps in the corridor with panic attacks, during which she covered her ears tightly and made a deafening animal hiss. Meanwhile, for law enforcement, this story turned into a criminal investigation. 2 armed officers were on duty at the door of the ward around the clock. The sheriff's detectives were absolutely sure that they were dealing with an unprecedented crime and a dangerous serial maniac. In their opinion, an unknown man had kidnapped the tourists, dragged them to an underground prison, and held them there. Investigators were pulling up old archives of unsolved cases, compiling lists of suspects. Everyone was waiting for only one thing: for the surviving woman to regain consciousness and name her tormentor. The police were preparing to hunt for the sadist, hoping to find clues that would lead them to the bodies of the other disappeared. They had no idea that the monster they were so desperately searching for had never existed, and that the real solution would be much more terrifying. The winter of 2018 was slowly turning into spring, but in an isolated room at the University of Utah Hospital, time seemed to have stood still. It had been almost 3 months since Priscilla Grant had been pulled from the underground crypt of Desolation Canyon. Her physical condition had slowly stabilized. Her body weight began to grow minimally, and her skin gradually responded to the treatment of scurvy. However, her consciousness remained completely inaccessible. The woman's mind was securely locked in a dark labyrinth from which she categorically refused to leave. She did not utter a single word, reacting to the appearance of hospital staff only with mute horror. The Emery County Police Department was rapidly losing patience. The investigation had reached a dead end, and public pressure was mounting. The detectives had assembled a massive database containing the dossiers of all known criminals, poachers, and dangerous recluses who had ever been caught within a 200-mile radius of the river. They were sincerely convinced that the maniac who had thrown the women into the cave was still walking free. Investigators prepared voluminous folders with photos of the suspects, waiting for the moment when the traumatized victim would point to her executioner. But the chief doctor strictly forbade any interrogations, citing the patient's extremely unstable condition. A breakthrough in the criminal case occurred only in early March 2018. Dr. Eris Thorne, a prominent forensic psychiatrist who specialized in the effects of prolonged isolation and severe trauma, was brought in to help. Thorne chose the tactic of absolute unobtrusiveness. He came to the semi-darkened ward at 10 o'clock in the morning every day. The doctor silently sat down in a chair and stayed there for 2 hours, making no attempt to speak to the patient. On the 7th day of his visits, he simply left a black-covered paper notebook and a soft graphite pencil on the metal bedside table. At first, Priscilla completely ignored these items. But 2 weeks later, the nurse on duty noticed a striking change. The pages of the notebook were densely scribbled with chaotic lines that resembled waves on water. Thorne continued with his daily routine until the first conscious contact took place on March 15th. That morning, Priscilla did not hide under the bed. She sat on the cold floor and looked directly at the doctor. According to medical protocol, Thorne slowly slipped her a notebook. The woman hesitantly took a pencil and wrote one word on the paper: silence. Over time, the words began to form short, jagged phrases. A week later, Priscilla spoke for the first time. Her voice was a quiet, barely audible broken whisper. Her ligaments had almost atrophied from the long period of inactivity, but she was finally ready to tell the investigators the truth. On March 22, 2018, at 11:30, 2 senior detectives were officially allowed into the room for the first time. The policemen were strictly ordered to take off their weapons and speak only in whispers. The investigator turned on a portable recorder, recording the time of the interrogation, and took out photos from a folder. The detective placed the photos in front of Priscilla with great care. According to the transcript of the interrogation, he asked her in the softest possible tone, "Priscilla, we know that you have been through a living hell. Look at these faces very carefully. Which one of them did this to you? Who drove you and your friends into that terrible dungeon?" What happened next destroyed all the theories of the police forever. Priscilla slowly looked down at the laid-out photos of the criminals. She stared at them silently for several minutes, showing no reaction or the slightest recognition. Then the woman raised her sunken eyes to the senior investigator. Her gaze was deep and completely empty, as if she were looking through it into a pitch-black void. On the saved recording from the dictaphone, she can be heard taking a heavy breath, and then her dry whisper cuts through the dead silence of the room. Nobody. There was no one there. Just us, the river, and absolute darkness. These eerie words sounded like a verdict for the entire investigation. There was no brutal abduction by a maniac or psychopath. All the thousands of hours of exhausting police work, combing databases, and interviewing witnesses had been in vain. The detectives looked at each other in a state of deep shock. If no one had kidnapped them, how could 3 experienced, well-equipped hikers be trapped in a completely isolated underground cavern with no way to the surface? The officer leaned closer to the girl, desperately trying to comprehend what he was hearing. He quietly asked what exactly had happened on the water route. Priscilla closed her eyes in pain. She whispered barely audibly that this tragedy was not the work of others. It was the result of just one fatal mistake and a sudden desire to have fun that changed the rules of their journey forever. Priscilla Grant reconstructed the events of that terrible day, piece by piece, sitting in a darkened hospital room, listening to a police recorder. Her testimony, spoken in a broken whisper, turned a criminal case of a mysterious disappearance into a documented chronicle of fatal human carelessness. The 3rd day of their water expedition, June 14, 2016, began as a perfect tourist adventure. The women woke up at sunrise, packed up camp, checked the fastening of the airbags, and launched the green raft. They were in the most isolated part of Desolation Canyon, about 30 miles from the starting point. Around them, massive red rocks rose like a solid wall, and the steady speed of the current allowed them to relax and just enjoy the wild scenery. Around 1 o'clock in the afternoon, the sun reached its zenith, and the air temperature exceeded 95 degrees Fahrenheit. There was an almost ringing silence around, broken only by the rhythmic splashing of oars. It was then that the usual adrenaline of passing through safe sections of the river seemed not enough for them. The feeling of complete isolation from civilization and euphoria played an incredibly cruel joke on the experienced tourists. Marlene Watson took a plastic container out of her waterproof bag. Inside were synthetic hallucinogens. The two friends had agreed to this risky experiment back in the city, naively believing that taking psychotropic substances in the middle of the wilderness would give them maximum spiritual unity with the mighty canyon. They took the drugs right on the water, without even mooring to a safe shore. The women relied on their experience and the fact that the river was supposed to remain relatively calm for the next few miles. But Desolation Canyon is a ruthless ecosystem that does not forgive the slightest lapse in vigilance. As the chemicals entered their bloodstream and began to actively affect their brains, the real world rapidly distorted beyond recognition. Priscilla recalled with horror to the investigators how the colors around her suddenly became unnaturally bright and blinding. The massive rocks along the banks seemed to be pulsating living organisms that hung predatory over them, and the sound of the river water gradually turned into a deafening, unbearable roar. The women had completely lost their sense of distance, flow speed, and time. They were in a state of deep, uncontrollable drug intoxication at the very moment when their boat approached the extremely dangerous zone. Ahead of them was a cascade of aggressive rapids of the 4th category of difficulty near Coal Creek. It was a narrow section of the riverbed with swirling white water and sharp boulders scattered randomly. In a sober state, the 3 professional hikers would have no problem bypassing this sector. They would have correctly read the current pattern, aligned the raft with the nose to the wave, and worked the oars in a coordinated manner. But under the destructive effects of strong hallucinogens, their coordination was completely destroyed. Instead of acting as a team, the women panicked. Priscilla tearfully recounted that they were laughing hysterically, then screaming with unreasonable animal terror. They rowed erratically, turning the boat sideways to the current, and only prevented each other from leveling the life-saving course. The raft was rapidly gaining speed, spinning uncontrollably around its axis. A powerful stream of white water picked up the polyurethane boat like a weightless chip. The current threw it with fierce force right into a massive granite rock that stood monolithically in the middle of the narrow channel. But the worst thing about this situation was not the moment of physical impact. Under this particular rock was a dangerous and deadly hydrological trap, the so-called underwater siphon. This is a specific pocket in the rock where the current draws huge masses of water, leaving no workaround on the surface. When the raft hit the wet rock at maximum acceleration, the enormous water pressure instantly crumpled its side. Above the roar of the rapids, a loud crack of torn polyurethane was heard. The very next second, the boat abruptly overturned, covering the helpless women's heads. The icy mountain water instantly took away their breath. Priscilla remembers only a terrible, irresistible rush downward. The hydraulic pressure of the underwater siphon was so powerful that even their professional life jackets could not keep their bodies on the surface. All 3 tourists were mercilessly pulled into the sinkhole, as if into a giant centrifuge, right under a multi-ton rock formation. The bright sunlight instantly disappeared for them, abruptly replaced by swirling darkness, where there was absolutely no room to breathe, and the frantic current was pulling their bodies into the eerie, black unknown. According to Priscilla Grant, the hydraulic shock of the underwater siphon completely deprived them of any control over their bodies. The icy current of the Green River pulled the women mercilessly into a narrow stone tunnel that stretched deep under a massive granite rock. For several endless seconds, they were thrown against sharp rock outcroppings. The water, under enormous pressure, was forced into their noses and mouths, leaving no chance for a rescue breath. The force of the flow was so enormous that professional life jackets were cracking at the seams, and the strong nylon straps were painfully cutting into their skin. Suddenly, this fierce pressure eased somewhat. An invisible hydrological force pushed them to the surface. The women instinctively took a greedy breath, filling their lungs with stale, extremely damp air. They surfaced, hoping to see the canyon sky, but instead of the dazzling Utah sun, they were greeted by pitch blackness. An underwater stream threw the tourists into a huge underground cavern that had absolutely no way to the surface above the water level. It was an airtight trap. In her testimony to investigators, Priscilla described the first minutes in this cave as falling into the deepest circle of hell. The thick darkness instantly deprived them of their sight. The eyes could not adapt to these conditions, as not a single photon of light penetrated the dungeon. However, the most insidious enemy was not the lack of light, but the powerful synthetic drugs that were still actively circulating in their blood. The effect of strong hallucinogens turned a critical situation into an unimaginable psychological nightmare. Their inflamed brains, deprived of visual reference points, began to generate their own horrific reality. Priscilla felt as if the slippery, wet vaults of the cave were constantly moving, narrowing, trying to crush them with their mass. The echo of the water splashing turned into a demonic whisper that came from everywhere. In the total darkness, the women imagined that thousands of eyes of predatory monsters were looking at them from the black water, waiting for the right moment to attack. Amidst this chaos, desperate screams could be heard above the water. Priscilla and Marlene Watson, holding on tightly to each other, miraculously managed to find a slippery stone ledge in the swirling water. Tearing off the skin on their palms, they struggled to pull their bodies onto the hard surface of the ledge. They began to hysterically call out to their third friend in the black void. But 28-year-old Bonnie Jones never made it to dry ground. As the forensic examination of her remains would establish much later, the girl suffered an extremely severe head injury when she hit the invisible underwater rocks. Her spatial coordination was completely destroyed not only by psychotropic substances, but also by physical damage to her brain. During interrogations, Priscilla tearfully recalled that she could clearly hear heavy breathing and faint strokes of hands on water nearby. Bonnie tried her best to stay afloat, but in the pitch black, disoriented by panic and pain, she could not figure out where to swim to shore. Her cries became weaker and weaker, the echo making it difficult to identify their source, until they were finally drowned in the noise of the underground stream. She drowned in the first hours after the disaster. Bonna's death was the first realization of the horror they were in. Priscilla and Marlene were left all alone in this dead underworld that smelled of silt and ancient stone. They were sitting tightly pressed together on a cold, uneven stone with ice water continuously dripping down. Their tourist clothes were soaking wet and stuck tightly to their bodies, taking away precious heat catastrophically fast. The air temperature in the dungeon was steadily hovering around 50 degrees Fahrenheit, low enough to cause inevitable and unavoidable hypothermia in the wet environment. They were crying and shivering, completely unaware of where the top was and where the bottom was, what the true dimensions of this cavern were, and whether there was any way back through the deadly underwater siphon. Behind them, they could only feel a hard, wet wall that offered no hope of escape. Each subsequent minute in complete isolation stretched like an hour. The narcotic thought slowly and painfully dissipated, leaving behind only the bare, icy reality of their hopeless situation. They were buried alive, many hundreds of feet underground. Without a scrap of food, without a single source of light, without any of their equipment, which the ruthless current had carried away with it further into the darkness. The two women tried to keep warm by hugging each other in the pitch black, but the real horror was just beginning. Little did they know that the stone outcropping on which they had found temporary and precarious shelter concealed in its darkness a slippery, invisible trap that would completely ruin their chances of getting out alive. For Priscilla Grant and Marlene Watson, time lost its usual meaning forever. In the underground cavern of Desolation Canyon, there was neither day nor night, only one endless cycle of absolute pitch blackness, and the monotonous sound of water echoing off the stone walls. The women found themselves in conditions that went far beyond any extreme survival. They had absolutely nothing left. No food, no light source, no matches or medicine. All the waterproof bags with provisions and special equipment disappeared without a trace in the bubbling black stream in the first minutes of their disaster. The temperature in the dungeon was steadily holding at a critical 50 degrees Fahrenheit. Their wet tourist clothes did not dry out at all, sticking tightly to their skin and turning each passing hour into a slow, agonizing torture from severe hypothermia. According to Priscilla's testimony, documented by the police, for the first few days they simply sat on a wet stone ledge, hugging each other tightly, desperately trying to keep at least the scant remnants of warmth. But soon, Marlene's instinct for self-preservation forced her to act. She categorically refused to believe that this was a dead end and decided to explore the invisible borders of their stone trap. Cautiously moving by feel, leaning on the slippery walls, the girl tried to find at least some narrow crevice that would lead up to the surface. This desperate attempt proved fatal for her. The stone, slippery from centuries of river silt, betrayed her. Marlene suddenly lost her balance and, with a loud scream, fell from a high ledge into an invisible black abyss between sharp granite boulders. Priscilla recalled hearing a dull, terrifying sound of impact and her friend's piercing scream, which echoed repeatedly off the cold cave floor. During this terrible fall, Marlene suffered a complex open fracture of her right leg. In the conditions of absolute unsanitary conditions, stagnant air and constant dampness, the medical consequences were not long in coming. The aggressive infection penetrated the open soft tissues extremely quickly. Within a few days, the young woman developed severe blood poisoning. Priscilla told experienced investigators with genuine horror how she sat helplessly beside her friend in complete darkness, holding her friend's hand tightly, which was hot from the high fever. She could only listen passively as Marlene slowly faded away. At first, the wounded girl moaned softly in unbearable pain, then began to deliriously call out loudly for her relatives, talking to the ghosts of the past. About 3 weeks after their accident on the river, Marlene's weak breathing stopped forever. Priscilla Grant was left all alone in a stone tomb deep below the surface of the earth. After the tragic death of her only friend, her human psyche, faced with the inevitable prospect of her own death, began to undergo irreversible transformations. Her brain adapted to the monstrous conditions in which it is impossible for a healthy person to survive by completely disabling all social barriers and rapidly awakening the deepest, most primitive instincts. The problem of dehydration was solved first. The woman learned to methodically lick off the icy condensation that regularly appeared on the uneven walls of the cave. But when the reserves of subcutaneous fat were completely depleted, and hunger became an unbearable, burning pain that made her stomach cramp, Priscilla finally turned into a predator. Relying solely on her sense of touch and her heightened receptors, she found a shallow pool at the very edge of the underground lake. Here, through an invisible siphon, a powerful river current sometimes carried small fish, and the local blind cave fish occasionally swam by. Priscilla's method of hunting would have amazed even the most experienced experts in extreme survival. The emaciated woman sat for hours, completely motionless, in waist-deep ice water. Her eyesight had completely atrophied due to the pitch blackness, but her hearing and skin tactile senses were sharpened to an incredible animal level. It learned to accurately detect the slightest microscopic vibrations of water. When live prey swam carelessly past her feet, Priscilla grabbed the slippery fish with her bare, torn hands in a lightning-fast, practiced movement. She ate this fish completely raw, greedily and methodically chewing every bone and scale. This raw meat became her only source of necessary proteins for a long 18 months. It completely lost track of time, living solely on basic animal reflexes, until the water level in the Green River dropped so low that people could finally enter the cave. The detectives, listening in silence to these shocking confessions in the hospital room, felt their blood run cold. Priscilla's story explained in great detail how she had managed to survive for a year and a half in such inhumane conditions. But the senior investigator, who had studied the physiological aspects of long-term survival in detail, suddenly realized an extremely frightening logical inconsistency. The cave fish was an extremely rare and cautious prey, and it took the emaciated woman a long time to learn how to successfully catch it with her bare hands. There was a gap of several long, unbearable weeks between the moment when the girl's energy reserves were to be completely depleted and her first truly successful hunt. And in order to survive this critical hunger period, being in complete darkness next to her dead friend, her animal instincts had to find another, much closer and more accessible source of necessary calories. On April 14, 2018, based on Priscilla Grant's detailed testimony and her incredibly accurate topographical descriptions of the underwater currents, the Emery County Police Department initiated the final search operation. At 7 o'clock in the morning, a special combined team of 12 highly trained professionals headed to the deadly Coal Creek Rapids. The team included experienced police divers, senior forensic scientists, and professional extreme cavers. It took several hours to navigate the river. The water level in the Zelena River was still at a relatively low level, which gave the rescuers a unique, perhaps the only chance to safely enter the deep underground system. At 11 hours and 45 minutes, the advance team reached the narrow fissure in question. Using more than 300 feet of heavy-duty Kevlar ropes, sophisticated block systems, and portable diesel generators to power searchlights, the team began an extremely slow descent into the rocky maw of Desolation Canyon. The descent through the vertical well took nearly 3 grueling hours. When the forensics team finally touched the hard bottom and deployed the main lighting, they were faced with the same blind underground cavern. It was the same hermetically sealed stone prison that had become the last refuge for the young tourists. The air in this enclosed space was incredibly thick, densely saturated with the suffocating smell of dampness, decay, and old silt. The ambient temperature did not exceed 50 degrees Fahrenheit. For the first time in many millennia, This isolated place was illuminated by bright artificial light. The beams of powerful police searchlights immediately snatched the gruesome details of the desperate struggle for life from the gloom. On the smooth, damp walls, about 5 feet above the water level, the experts recorded hundreds of deep, chaotic scratches and long-dried stains of human blood. It was a terrible, mute testament to how, in the first weeks, the girls, gripped by animal terror, desperately tried to find even the smallest crack, hysterically tearing their nails off the hard granite in the pitch black. At 15 hours and 20 minutes, the team of climbers began to methodically examine the muddy bottom of the black underground lake. Visibility in the water was almost zero, so the search was conducted exclusively by touch. At a depth of about 15 feet, firmly wedged between two massive granite boulders, one of the divers found the first skeleton. It was the remains of 28-year-old Bonnie Jones. The forensic examination would undoubtedly confirm the presence of a massive fracture of the temporal bone of the skull, which the girl had received during a catastrophic impact on an underwater siphon. Later, moving along the wall, on a completely dry stone ledge, forensic scientists discovered the skeletal remains of 29-year-old Marlene Watson. It was this terrible discovery that made even the most emotionally cold investigators involuntarily shudder. Marlene's leg bones bore clear signs of a complex open fracture. However, the darkest secret of this tragedy was hidden elsewhere. A detailed examination revealed multiple deep furrows on the woman's ribs and femurs, which had been left by the sharp edges of roughly broken stones. These man-made injuries finally confirmed the police's eerie guess as to what Priscilla had been eating during those most critical months, long before her instincts had adapted to catching blind fish with her bare hands. On May 20th, 2018, the Emery County Sheriff's Office organized a final press conference, officially closing one of Utah's most bizarre criminal cases. This unprecedented tragedy deeply affected the American public. It was not the hypothetical presence of a violent maniac that frightened people, but the realization of the absolute, blind ruthlessness of wildlife. One reckless decision, made only for the sake of short-term entertainment and fatally reinforced by synthetic drugs, in an instant forever erased the thin line between normal life and primordial death. The cold labyrinth of Desolation Canyon forced an ordinary person to rapidly descend to the very bottom of the food chain. To save his own life, the victim had to step over the strictest moral taboos and turn into an underground predator whose only goal was to keep breathing in the endless darkness. Official justice has put an end to this story. The district court fully recognized Priscilla Grant's actions as a state of extreme necessity for survival, dropping all charges against her. However, this verdict meant nothing to the woman herself. She is doomed to spend the rest of her crippled life in a closed ward of a specialized psychiatric clinic on the outskirts of Salt Lake City. Her ward is plunged into deep semi-darkness around the clock, and the patient herself sits motionless for hours in the farthest corner. Dr. Eris Thorne, who continues to treat her, recorded one extremely disturbing detail in his non-public notes. Every night, at exactly 3:15, Priscilla suddenly wakes up, cautiously gets out of bed, presses her ear tightly to the cold floor of the clinic, and begins to whisper monotonously. Listening intently to the subtle vibrations of the water pipes deep beneath the building's massive foundation, she claims with horror that she can clearly hear the Black River slowly making its new path in the darkness, and that the icy water is already impatiently looking for its next victims.